Dear ladies and gentlemen, дорогі українці, I can't believe this is already episode number 20 in our series of conversations of Ukrainian and foreign intellectuals, experts in different fields. We're discussing here different aspects of Russia's war against Ukraine. To share this knowledge with you, our listeners, who are keen to learn more, think deeper, and hear from the original sources. Важко повірити, що це вже 20-й епізод нашої серії розмов українських та зарубіжних інтелектуалів, експертів у різних галузях. Ми обговорюємо тут різні аспекти війни Росії проти України, аби поділитися цими знаннями із вами, нашими слухачами, що прагнуть дізнатися більше, думати глибше та чути із першоджерел. This is a project of PEN Ukraine, as we all know that its entire team stays in Ukraine fighting hard for the freedom of expression and for their lives. One of those volunteers fighting for the people's lives is Evgen Stasinevich, a well-known literary critic who systematically collects aid for Kharkiv and the region. Medicine, various humanitarian supply, and food. He buys and delivers, and Kharkiv will be grateful to you for any donation. Please find all the details in the comments. Це проєкт «Пен Україна». Як ми усі знаємо, команда залишається в Україні, наполегливо борючись за свободу слова та за своє життя. Одним із волонтерів, які борються за життя людей, є Євген Стасіневич, відомий літературознавець, який систематично збирає допомогу для Харкова та області. Ліки, різноманітні гуманітарні товари та продукти харчування. Він купує і доставляє. Харків буде вдячний вам за будь-яку пожертву. Будь ласка, знайдіть усі деталі у коментарях. The project is co-hosted by PEN International, which has continued to provide a platform for freedom of expression for those currently under the highest risk. We work under the PEN International Charter. Співорганізатором проєкту є Міжнародний ПЕН, який продовжує надавати платформу для свободи вираження поглядів для тих, хто перебуває в групі найвищого ризику. Ми дотримуємося хартії Міжнародного ПЕН. We are grateful to our partners for today, who are traditionally PEN America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, the Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. Special thanks to Yulia Sienkiewicz for making things happen. We are streaming today's event to all partners' Facebook pages. Сьогодні нашими партнерами є традиційно PEN Америка, Український інститут Лондона, Україна Світ, Український науково-дослідний інститут Гарвардського університету та інститут Гаррімана при Колумбійському університеті. Окремо дякую Юлії Сінкевич за допомогу в організації події. Ми транслюємо сьогоднішню подію на всі партнерські сторінки у Facebook, і захід відбуватиметься англійською мовою. And I will switch into English to introduce our today's guests. Both of our today's guests are directors. We received a lot of jokes about our poster saying Director General vice the film director. So two of you are the people who make a difference in the human perspectives. But what would be great to discuss today is how this war is perceived in the UK and internationally, and especially in the art circles, and how artists and filmmakers can explore war-related themes in their work, and what is the remit of their responsibility there. Let's also touch a roundabout still a bit tricky for the Western listeners theme of Ukraine's call to suspend cultural cooperation with Russia and presentation of Russian films, music, and art until the war in Ukraine is over. And from Ukrainian side, I'm happy to welcome Volodymyr Sheiko, Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, Ukraine's cultural diplomacy organization established in 2018 and affiliated to the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has held arts management, marketing, and communication roles at the British Council in Southeastern Europe and Central Asia, and has designed, programmed, and implemented over 200 cultural projects across Europe and the US, so quite familiar with the international cultural context. Volodymyr Sheiko holds a master's degree in international relations from the National University of Kyiv and is graduate of the Center of Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California, LA. Volodymyr will talk today with Peter Weber, a British film and television director and producer whose debut feature film as a director was Go with a Pearl airing back in 2003. But that's not the only thing you should know about our today's guest. Peter explored the counterculture of turnout Valley Road protesters in his underground. His earlier miniseries, Man Only, trades controversy for its frank and, let's say, shocking portrayal of the dark side of male's masculinity and sexuality. I don't really know how to put together all the different topics Peter has researched about his film and TV career development, but it's an award-winning documentary director who directed several programs about classical music, including child prodigies, composers such as Richard Wagner, or popular science documentaries about a range of subjects, including crash test dummies, deep sea life, and phantom limbs. What I can say, it's all about discovering some deep and hidden sides of human and nature itself. And I presume such a combination of speakers and deep gaze can give us really interesting perspectives and insights today. So, dear gentlemen, the floor is yours. Wishing you a really great conversation.
Thank you. That's an amazing introduction. And I now feel scared, and I'm sure Volodymyr does as well, that we can live up to your high hopes, but we'll try our best. Volodymyr, listen, sorry, I just need to talk because as I told you beforehand, that little chat beforehand, you know, I've been a documentary director for a long time, and that's kind of weaponized my nosiness. So I need to ask some questions of you before we start talking about some of these more abstract, intellectual, cultural themes that they want us to discuss. One day, you're like me, you work in the cultural sector, you're on the phone, you have an office to go to, you have some meetings to do, you know, there's some thoughts that they're, you know, I know in the east of Ukraine, there's always been a problem. You have the forces massing, but many people are saying, no, there's not going to be a war, you know, and then suddenly, a war is declared, you know, and the Russians attack with massive force, and there's massive loss of life. What I just want to know first, on a personal level, what is that like? What is that rupture like in your life? Can you expose your soul a bit to us and let us know how it changed and how you moved from Kiev to Lviv? Yeah.
Hi, Peter, and hi, everyone. Thank you for the question. It's a tough one to answer, of course, and you know it. Yeah. This rupture, it wasn't unexpected. It wasn't totally unexpected that Russia will eventually invade Ukraine and will try to seize control of the country and try to subdue our country. But at the same time, it was a huge surprise for many, despite the fact that many people have packed, you know, a couple of weeks before the actual invasion began and were kind of ready to move on or to relocate. It came as a big surprise to most people, at least in my social circles. I wouldn't say that my daily routine changed too much, because the meetings, the phone calls, the work that I've been doing quadrupled. I had lots of more things to do after the invasion began than before, because the cultural relations work that the Ukrainian Institute has been doing is now more essential than ever. So in that dimension, it's more work, it's more responsibility, it's more pressure to deliver, right? On a personal level, I think the first several weeks where we have lived in a limbo, in a bubble. So it was very much later that I realized how Ukraine and my life has changed, fundamentally changed. And the worst thing is, I don't know if I'm ever coming back to my old life and reality. And so I mean, the people around me don't either. And what I think about this situation is that I realized how elusive the war can be, despite it happening right in front of your eyes or in television, because it happens in so many dimensions, in so many levels, that sometimes they're visible to you, sometimes you can touch them, you can relate to them, but sometimes it's completely out there, intangible. And that's fascinating and scary at the same time.
Yeah, one of the things I think that is interesting, terrible for the Ukrainian people to have to deal with, but interesting is the way that this information is disseminated, the way that things that we thought of as being maybe frivolous or dangerous in a minor way, social media, you know, that the war is being sent straight into our telephones, that maybe bears some relationship to the way the the Vietnamese war appeared on TV in American living rooms, but it's that much more intense because you carry your phone around with you wherever you go. So it feels much more present. And obviously for people like me living in Western Europe, we have been aware of other terrible wars, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, but this geographically is that much closer, and it feels to impinge on us in a way and to remind us of periods of history that we thought were long forgotten. So I think there's a definitely different relationship and much more involved relationship that people in the West have. But I still think, even with all of that, we have a sense of I don't know whether it's a sense of entitlement or whether it's just a sense of, there's an inbred sense of security here. And I think the process of us realizing that we shouldn't have that sense of security is, I mean, I think that's just beginning. And that's something that's slowly happening, but for you, that must have happened overnight.
Would you say that this war actually is the one that is now the closest that a war can get for people who live or who are based in, for example, Western Europe? Because you mentioned Vietnam, and people of my generation have experienced or have witnessed Vietnam, I think only through the lens of American films.
Yeah. No, this is
trying to make sense of that war, right? Yeah, and then the Gulf War, and then the Balkan wars, and then the Chechnya War. I think that was completely out of people's kind of information space back in the 90s and early thousands. Yeah. Would it be fair to, and Syria even, despite it made all the international headlines, it was a terrible tragedy. I think it also kind of slipped through unnoticed for so many people. So would you say that the war in Ukraine
I think so, for a number of reasons, and not all good, I have to say. And to get one elephant in the room out there, I think that for a lot of people in Western Europe, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Syria, they othered it. It was Arabs, it was brown people, and I think there is a bit of an off switch for a lot of people, and that is a very negative thing. But you have to recognise the reality of it. And then there is just the very simple thing that this war is not so far away from us. It feels like it could be happening to us. For me personally, it's difficult to I think I have a slightly different relationship with it because I've spent some time in Ukraine. I have Ukrainian friends. I was head of the jury at the Odessa Film Festival. I've given workshops over there. So I've experienced at firsthand Ukraine as a modern European city with, and I've dealt with in my work with young, well-educated, diverse, metropolitan, liberal. I've seen that side of that. So when people start calling Ukraine Nazi, it just makes me laugh. That side of the propaganda. So, but I think maybe my relationship to it is a bit closer because I had never been to any of the countries that I have experienced stories of war about, be it on television news or social media. But I know Odessa a little bit. I know Kiev a little bit. I have some friends, and some quite good friends that I made through working over there, and that for me as a personal thing makes it much stronger, I think, than beforehand. So it's not just something intellectual, something different. It's not just about geopolitics. It personalizes it, and to have talked to some of my friends or kept in touch with them and acquaintances, to hear these firsthand stories is very troubling and very upsetting. And so I suspect I'm more finely attuned than maybe some people, but I was just in this little village in the middle of nowhere in Andalusia, a tiny town square, and there on a Monday afternoon are 3 stalls, and some local ladies have come down and they've put all their bric-a-brac out there, old china figures, and they've written a sign to help Ukraine, stop the war, and all of this. And and so you can see, actually it made me very emotional to see that people that it has touched people's hearts here, and that there is a groundswell of support and understanding and love, and that does, I think, filter up, because it gives the governments having to make serious decisions about money about military aid and the rest of it that helps support those decisions. Do you feel that where you are? I mean, I know you have, because you haven't left the country since what, February or something, you know, and you've been there while it's at war. Can you feel the support? Is it more complex? Do you feel beleaguered? We're not helping you enough. I'd like to know how you experience it, because you're in the cauldron.
Well, I feel that support is actually overwhelming from most parts of the world. And I appreciate what you said about kind of being connected to Ukraine through your work. You visited, you made friends in Ukraine, and for you, probably, I suppose, it's easier to relate to the war and to sympathize with Ukrainians. What I found really kind of astonishing, that not all people across the world visited Ukraine or had any connection to Ukraine before the 24th of February, and still overnight, without even being aware of what Ukraine actually is about and how diverse it is, and you know how cities in Ukraine look like, people still kind of switched on to that you know, helping mode and mobilize themselves, their communities, their politicians, and you know, contributed greatly to the humanitarian effort that helps Ukraine. And I'm really grateful for that. And I'm just wondering, I'm just keep asking myself this question: what was that switch that made people so attuned to Ukraine?
I think that might be, it's a great question. And I don't know whether we're going to be able to answer it now. You know, sometimes because you're in this, and therefore we're in this. Whether, you know, because you can't, you know, this is part of our world now. But to understand yet that very, very good question, I don't know whether I'm smart enough to. I think I'd need a little bit of perspective to see exactly what it is. Some things are different, maybe because the struggle in the Balkans, which was very terrible and had some similar aspects as well. There are some things we can recognize. It was perceived as a civil war, yeah, and that means people look at it differently to this invasion by a nuclear power, a giant force, you know, slightly humbled over recent years because of what's happened to its old empire. And I think that nations that lose their empire, this happened to my country as well, Great Britain, I think they have a kind of a nervous breakdown. You know, some do it in smaller ways like Brexit, and some do it in heinous ways like Russia has. I've lost my thread, sorry.
What was that switch that made people?
That's what you said, yeah, the switch. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I don't know whether, for example, it's to do with this thing about it not being a civil war, but it being an aggressor, a very powerful aggressor. I think there's a bit of that. I think one of the things is just people have responded to the bravery that we've seen. Let's say to the story that's been very cleverly crafted, because, you know, Zelensky has proved to be a great leader and a great communicator, and he's surrounded by professionals in my business, and they've been able to craft a story because it's based on the truth. That is very, very compelling. There's a David versus Goliath aspect. I think many people just expected this, as much as Putin did, to peter out in, or, you know, to be decided in 3 days, let's say. You know, there seems to have been some expectation from the Russians that the country would roll over, and it would be a relatively cost-free thing. And I think that resistance stokes a kind of admiration. In the UK, it ties into certain of our own national myths about Dunkirk, about the Battle of Britain, so on and so forth. Some of these myths are really myths and have been gilded over the years, but that's maybe a conversation for another day. So I think that really has factored into it. You know, there's been a spirit that people have shown. The awfulness of some of the things that we've discovered about the way the Russian army has operated, Bucha, so on and so forth. You know, so I think there's many things. I think people feel more vulnerable when there's a war that's happening elsewhere, you know, to people who don't look like us. It seems further away, you know, and like I said beforehand, that's you know, there's a side of that is racist and terrible. So all of these things here, and it's brought right into us. And I would imagine for teenagers, for example, seeing this stuff on, I don't really go on TikTok, but I have younger friends who do. And, so people are experiencing it. It's not just mediated by, the 6 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news or whatever. So.
Yeah, well, I think you're very right to say that communications plays a very important role in this, in how the world perceives this war in Ukraine. And you're right to say that it's also a carefully constructed, effort, right, led by the Ukrainian government and our president, in a very good way, a carefully constructed effort, because what I observe from my observations, what really touches people and kind of gets across to people internationally are those tiny little stories and visual signs of visual signs that you can use to generalize and to kind of think that you do have a broader picture of what's going on in Ukraine. And I was asked a question a couple of days ago at another discussion whether it is appropriate to employ humor in communications about war. Is it appropriate to create memes and share them on TikTok or internet? Is it appropriate to make jokes or to take any kind of silly situation or visual and spread it and illustrate the war? Of course, discussing all the atrocities and all the terrible tragedies that are happening in Ukrainian cities that are being razed to the ground. But I think my reply to that question is that it helps. Humor helps to cope. Humor helps to make sense of something that otherwise is unthinkable or unimaginable or inconceivable. And then humor helps spread that information to people in a way that is not kind of intrusive and dramatic. And I think that
I agree completely. I think what you're saying about humor is interesting because it's part of a people's toolkit for survival. Really, it allows an escape and a moment of levity, and in terrible situations, I think the British have that kind of gallows humor, we call it over here. And this is the thing is that just as during I'm in Spain at the moment, and I was recently up in Madrid looking at an exhibition about Picasso's Guernica. And its historical context, and although there are important differences between, and what was happening in Spain in the mid-30s is not what's happening here. There was a civil war compared to a colonial invasion. There are things that you can see in terms of the way that the Republican side was using propaganda against the fascists, against the nationalists. They were using posters, they were using jokes, they were using, there was a broad popular front, and I think some of the same issues are still alive. Different war, different peoples, different geopolitical dynamics. But I think you can see some things in that. And I think it's interesting as well in terms of, to some extent, forcing people to make a stand. I think it's very difficult to just stand by and ignore this. You have to say which side of the line you're on. There, an interesting discussion that happened at the beginning, and I've not taken it up since, but at the very beginning, I think there was a big debate, and I'd like to hear your feelings about this, about whether there should be a cultural boycott, okay? Which I understand is very complicated, and one must be very careful to distinguish between the regime, Putin, the army, against the people of Russia and the culture of Russia. But having said that, this is a crisis situation. It's something that hasn't happened in our generation before. And if you look at, let's say, apartheid, Mandela very clearly said that the economic and the cultural boycott were instrumental in bringing South Africa to a positive, democratic, inclusive conclusion. So where do you stand in this debate, and do you think Russian voices culturally should be silenced? Do you think there's an argument for that?
Yes, we stand quite clearly in that debate. We called for a suspension of any cultural cooperation with Russia and presentation of Russian culture internationally, I think 2 days after the invasion had begun. And so did a lot of other culture professionals and government bodies in Ukraine, because we stand united in a position that culture is a powerful tool of influence. It is able to change people's minds. It is able to, unfortunately, to twist and manipulate public opinion, and it is able to spearhead atrocities, right? Or conceal them, or disguise them, or put them aside and put something else in the forefront of the conversation. And unfortunately, Russia has used culture for ages to that end. And I think it's not fair to distinguish too much between the regime and the soldiers that invaded Ukraine and the ordinary good Russians, because that's a false distinction. Any regime is flesh and bone of the society that it represents, or the society that elected this regime. We may discuss and debate on how things can be manipulated, election fraud, etc., but you can't deny that overwhelming majority of Russians voted for Putin, and now they clearly support the actions of the Russian army in Ukraine. And I just think that there is a fundamental fracture in people's minds who are able to actually sit peacefully in a theater or a film theater somewhere in Europe or the US and watch or consume or relate to Russian art today, knowing everything that happened in Bucha, for example. So to me, that abyss between those two things is huge, and I don't think it can be bridged.
Yep. Why do you think then that there are Western liberals who would be who would support Ukraine, and who would condemn the Russian invasion, but they say that it would be, to impede free speech, to embargo, I don't know, let's say a Russian filmmaker or whatever. They feel, and I've had these discussions, they feel that this right to free speech is primary, and that it's very important not to conflate artists, filmmakers, writers, whatever, with their regime, and that in a sense you're overstepping the mark. What do you say to them?
I think that, well, I've heard that argument many times since February. What I think, what parallel I can make to this is, under martial law, for example, the state can limit some of the freedoms that people have previously enjoyed in a time of peace. And I think in Ukraine, the society at large is okay with that. So we collectively appreciate that we need to limit ourselves in something to be able to help the military, to be able to stay together as a society, to speak one voice, for example, internationally when we talk about this war. So I think in an extraordinary time like this, it's not a threat to free speech or to democracy to contain some of the toxic voices, right? Or to exclude them temporarily from the discourse. But I think it's essential for us all to understand that we all have to make small sacrifices on the way to something bigger, and that something bigger is essentially peace in Ukraine. So Ukraine is not trying to kind of destroy the consensus of freedom of expression internationally. It just asks to be careful about what voices speak, and more importantly, I think, what value that brings to international cultural dialogue. I think that's something I want to ask back to you today.
Sorry, one question, just to kind of dissect that. Does that mean that what you're saying is not there should be a blanket ban on Russia, let's say everywhere, completely, cultural embargo, as well as the economic embargo. We're not going to not going to read Russian writers anymore. We're not going to look at their films. We're not going to, or does it mean you want us to behave intelligently, and to block the voices of hatred and the voices that are supporting the regime? I mean, is this a complete Iron Curtain, can I say, or is this something that can be more intelligently applied? Or no, that's a value judgment. I don't mean more intelligently applied. That could use some intelligence to show that there may be gradations here. Yeah, I want to know how absolutist it is. I understand in Ukraine it might have to be, but for people outside who are living a different experience.
What I think is that intelligent application of that concept is actually suspension of Russian cultural representation in the world until the war is over, until Russia is held responsible for everything it committed in Ukraine. Because myself, I'm reiterating the question about this value of those Russian voices in the world today, because I don't see how that can help, right? Russia has been overrepresented internationally compared to so many other countries who also deserve attention and a voice. But not everyone in the world, treated, Ukraine, Lithuania, Georgia, Moldova as anywhere equal to the Russian cultural machine in a way, right? So to me, that's also an issue of fair representation, essentially. So that's why I'm asking you this question. So what value does that bring? Opposition voices, good Russians, whoever is opposed to the regime and has been for a long time, how that can help Europe achieve peace in Ukraine and save lives in Ukraine? That's the fundamental question I just keep asking myself.
Yep. And I think that is the central nub of the question, isn't it? And obviously it's going to be perceived differently if you are in Ukraine where you feel this existential threat against yourself as an individual, against your family, your friends, your country as a whole. And I think unless it's keenly felt in the West, there'll still be this equivocation. I mean, I think there is a strong argument that Russia should be made to feel completely isolated on every level at the moment until the fighting stops. I do understand that people have concerns about censorship, let's say, but I think in the end that lives are more important than there's plenty of time to catch up with people's films later on, once this is resolved. So but it's still, I think in terms of, I think there is work that you guys have to do to promote this opinion. If you want your opinion to predominate in the West, I think it has to be pushed out and prosecuted, because I think at the moment, this debate, censorship, let's say compared to the defense of Ukraine, I think it's quite evenly balanced in certain sections.
It's not even, you're right. And I think most of the people who I have spoken to, or my colleagues did, have, the first instinctive reaction to the call for boycott, suspension, whatever you call it, is rejection, based on concerns for freedom of speech, concerns of censorship, concerns of racism even, or, there are a lot of other viewpoints on the situation. But once you get into the conversation, once you find the right argument that fits into your interlocutor's vocabulary, I think that conversation can become easier. And I had many warm conversations that started in a difficult way, but actually were resolved quite nicely for both of us, because you can explain this through very different words and concepts, and
but also I think, sorry to interrupt, but on some level, what I feel a frustration about is that it's very easy for us to sit here in our peaceful Western European countries debating the niceties of free speech, when you look at what has actually happened to your country, you know, a proud independent country that gets invaded by its massively more powerful neighbor, where war crimes are carried out on your territory, where the rhetoric that is coming from that country is not only, oh, we're going to invade, we're going to reset the balance of power. It's these Ukraine doesn't exist, this country doesn't exist, these people are Russians. There's a whole dialogue which is scary. It's ethno-nationalist, it's fascist, and you see very quickly when things like Bucha happen that this is not like, you know, some kind of homecoming, you know, that Putin fantasizes about, bringing all these Slavic peoples together, that it is going to be a dystopia if he were to win, or if he were to carry out the plans that were in his head, you know, the day before he invaded Ukraine. Ukraine would be squashed, dismembered, brutalized. There were the kill lists. There were, you know, it would become a hellscape. It's not like if you guys went, oh yeah, we're going to give up, that suddenly everything would be wine and roses and that's fine. The opposite, I think. And I think that if people understand the severity of the military attacks, if they understand exactly what the ideology behind this is, you know, if you actually have had a look at what Putin has said and he's written, and some of the intellectuals around him, and certainly some of the TV stations around him, if you paid attention to that, then you begin to understand the deep horror that we should look at this with. And I think that changes, you know, rather than sitting around drinking cups of tea, kind of talking about free speech, we face something arguably, you know, as much of a moral existential challenge as when the Nazis were conquering Europe. I think there are strong similarities, you know, between there's different iconography, but there's strong similarities with the discourse, let's say, and the ideology. And it's very scary. And maybe this is one of the other things people don't necessarily realize intellectually, but on some gut level, they do. That means so many people have rallied to Ukraine. Certainly for me, the more I've uncovered this, you know, and the more that I've read, the more stark the divisions seem to be.
But see, what you've just you know, listed as all the kind of toxic narratives and tropes that were perpetuated by Russia and its proxies in many other places, was enabled, ironically and sadly, by the free speech, by the very, you know, notion of free speech that is you know, used and perceived by default everywhere in the free world. So free speech enabled Russia to freely speak and use all the different platforms in media, cultural platforms, etc., to perpetuate and promote all those narratives through culture, through international media, through international academia that is deeply, you know, bogged in a very Russia-centric view of Eastern Europe and the world. And now, you know, I'm not trying to be seen as someone who questions free speech. I'm a committed liberal myself, so of course I wouldn't go that goes against my beliefs. But I think that's a counterpoint when people have to realize that free speech has its shortcomings, has its disadvantages, and there has to be a very fluid consensus on where it can be limited for the greater good. And this is something, for example, that the social media have, you know, started doing in the aftermath of the invasion. They are trying to find ways to devise algorithms, to devise policies, to improve policies, to filter out all that malicious, toxic, unwanted, manipulative, false content that plays ultimately into the hands of what Russia is doing in Ukraine and elsewhere in the region, for that matter.
Yeah, Karl Popper, in his writings about totalitarianism, pinpointed this as being something that, because he was trying to find this dividing line, that tolerant societies, when should tolerant societies become censorious, forbid things? And for him, it was important that we didn't tolerate intolerance, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But if you tolerate intolerance, then what it does is eventually the sort of the acid of intolerance dissolves away tolerance and destroys any notion of free speech at all, you know. So, and clearly the worst kind of intolerance is what Russia is practicing on Ukraine at the moment, which is to attack you and, you know, move. I mean, you can really see in Russian foreign policy the way that it's moved from maybe a more cautious policy of deterrence to probing what the Western response would be and what the Ukrainian response would be into full-on compellence, and it has not worked out 100% well for him. I suspect that if dear Mr. Putin had a time machine, he could go back and speak to himself, that he might make another choice, yeah? Because it really has not gone as planned. He has caused many of the things that he says he was scared about. Sweden and Finland now talking about joining NATO, massive Western military aid to Ukraine. So all of these things that he was purportedly frightened about, he has hastened in some way. So what he's achieved is the opposite of what he hoped for. But now he is in this hole. I wonder how do you have any idea of how things are going to progress? Are you surprised, for example, how successful your army were?
That's a good question. I think we were all proudly surprised by that, because obviously the Ukrainian army hasn't wasted the past 8 years that
clearly not
since the beginning of the war in 2014. But I think the early successes of the army in the first days or weeks of the invasion were quite staggering, and I think they lifted and elevated the spirits of so many people because of that, because, you know, everyone was speaking about their three-day victorious campaign, that the conquest of Kiev and installation of the puppet government, etc. So none of that, thank God, happened. But yeah, people were proudly surprised. But then I think we all now take it for granted that this is a great army. The support from the West is great. That's not the reason, however, to be complacent about this, because you know, the losses are huge. We have to be aware of that. And of course, there is great destruction of civil infrastructure, of military infrastructure, and it will take a very, very long time for Ukraine to recover and to rebuild. So
yes, of course.
But I think that's a very much the spirit of so many people here in Ukraine, that they are aware of the sheer tragedy of this situation, but they're very resilient in how, you know, we perceive this war, we perceive the army, and we perceive the future. That will not be easy, right? And myself, for example, and my friends, we often talk about us being that generation that, you know, life is being stolen from us. Peaceful time, professional growth, just leisure and ordinary life is being stolen from us, not just for the duration of this war, but for many, many years to come.
For many years ago, no, agreed.
It's so unfair, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can really see how that must, in a way, be a terrible loss, and a great challenge, you know. And sometimes I don't want to minimize the loss, the heartbreak, the death, the suffering, or anything like that. But is there not a level on which Ukraine has really been born in this fire, has been turned into something like incredibly strong and powerful and dignified, that might not have happened in other circles? I'm just trying to find a silver lining. I don't want to be, you know, because I you know, everyone knows how terrible war is, but bad things can happen, and the good can come out of them, you know. So we have to hope we get the military solution we want, which is Russia out of Ukraine. Then your country is going to have the greatest mission it's probably ever had in its history, and I think there can be something quite ennobling about that, or I hope, just reaching to look for something optimistic. And this is one of the reasons you need to pull your filmmakers off the front line and get them back and get them to start making movies again. Okay, I'm sure you can spare one or two. You've got some great filmmakers. So, and you understand above all people how important soft power is, how important challenging the narrative is. You know, so because I know there's a fair number of them who are out there at the moment. But it could. I think there is, you know. What can I say? Difficult circumstances also creates great art as well, you know.
That's a fair point, and that's that kind of optimistic hope for a better future is something that keeps us going. But I think the price this time will be incomparably high to all other difficult periods in Ukrainian history, at least of the past 30 years. But you're right that the filmmakers and culture makers in general in Ukraine,
culture makers in general,
will have a huge job, I mean, now, today, but also in the nearest future to make sense of this war, to document this war, to interpret this war. And actually, this is something I wanted to also talk to you about, how to do this. How would you do this if you were to film and to create a film about Ukraine? What is that kind of, you know,
I have been thinking about this. The important thing, obviously, is that the most important voices are Ukrainian voices, first-hand voices. The last thing in the world you need is a load of tourists like me coming along. But, you know, because you have amazing filmmakers there. But having said that, if you look at France in the late 60s, there was this film, Loin de Vietnam, which was made by Alain René, Jean-Luc Godard, Chris Marker. You know, they were trying to make a film that educated, informed, and you know, in which they kind of took an activist stance to inform the population of France at the time. So I think there could well be room for other voices. Let's hope that your country gets to a point soon enough when you can pull the filmmakers back and the scriptwriters and all the rest of them and start, you know, chewing on this and reflecting on it. And it's you know, I think that there'll be some very, very powerful statements, artistic statements that will stand the test of time. And like I said beforehand, you know, the only thing, because otherwise you just fall back into despair, which is impossible. You just have to look at the successes so far and you know, the job of communication you guys have been doing in galvanizing the rest of us. And I know that we have to finish shortly, but I'd like to hear finally from you, Volodymyr. What do you want from us? What do you want from me personally? What do you want? But let's widen it, because I'm a very privileged, particular, you know, little corner there working in the cultural field. Let's say of Western Europe. You know, if you want to leave us with a message, what do you want us to do? What do you think our responsibility is?
I think I would really appreciate from you, from the international culture sector, from colleagues in other countries and peers in other countries and intellectuals who are, you know, willing to invest themselves into helping Ukraine. I would appreciate attention. I would appreciate this, and it is also very important to look kind of beyond the next couple of months, because Ukraine eventually will disappear, unfortunately, from the news headlines internationally. Something else bad or even worse, unfortunately, will happen somewhere in the world. But that reconstruction period, that rebuilding, that recovery from war will last for much longer. And I think now, with such overwhelming attention and support for Ukraine, I think it's really important for people and institutions to kind of think ahead and work with Ukrainian filmmakers, script writers, theater makers, writers, poets, I don't know, visual artists, just to think a little bit longer term and realize that all these people, unfortunately, will find themselves, have already found themselves in very precarious and difficult circumstances professionally, because most of them want to work, but they have no, you know, conditions or opportunities to do so. So in the months and even years to come, I would think of programs, opportunities, themes that relate to Ukraine, that connect Europe and the world to Ukraine. And that space that will emerge in the result for Ukraine to be more represented internationally.
Okay, that's a very, very good answer. I really look forward, and I hope it's in the not too distant future, to you and I, Volodymyr, meeting in person in Kiev or wherever, raising a glass of Kraina Vuko, which is my horseradish vodka, which is my favorite drink, you know, and having some Ukrainian borscht and all the rest of it, and getting to discuss this in person. I think we're reaching the end of our time now, aren't we, Olha?
Yes, and we also have a couple of questions. Some maybe were already replied, but first of all, I want to thank you for this kind of mental exercise on international art relations and communication, and also for talking about the tolerating intolerances. Thank you also for touching the ground about the context of freedom of expression, fair and equal representation, and values which different voices bring to the shared international discourse. And we have a question from Tony on Twitter about the banning classics as Tchaikovsky or Dostoevsky. This is quite basic question we keep receiving since I remember myself identified as Ukrainian, and I was asking myself, why should I prioritize Pushkin poems learning in school or my own ABC book, starting with the poems about Lenin over beautiful Ukrainian poetry? So I guess that Volodymyr responded it clearly with his statement of fair representation instead of bringing here the context of censorship, right? This is about that Slavic studies should stop being just Russian studies, right? But what about Poland? What about Slovenian? What about, you know, all the other Czech brilliant arts, right? So this is about just fair representation. But if you want to add anything to this, because that's classical question we always get is, should we ban, let's say, classic or not?
No, I mean, that's a fair question. I think we keep getting it, of course, from many people. And my answer to that, let's shelve all that great culture that many people across the world love and would like to enjoy. Let's wait for a couple of years, for as long as it takes, actually, to, you know, to none of that will disappear. We can return to that. But that's not the time to do it now.
Thank you. And the second question from Zahar Davidenko was maybe to both of you from the different perspectives, that do you think people all around the world now see the difference between Russia and Ukraine, and what should we do to make this difference more recognizable and obvious?
I'll take that first. It's a very difficult question to answer, because I'm not all around the world. I live in a fairly small, you know, liberal elite bubble, and I get, where do I get information from? You know, I get some information from social media, from newspapers, from, you know, so on and so forth. I think there is more awareness. I think that winning, or certainly not losing, does an awful lot, because people love a winner, you know. I think that people who are intelligent and interested are delving into the history and into the complexities of it. But for lots of people, it's just a day-to-day thing. You know, they're on their telephone, they see a bit of TikTok, they see a bit of Twitter, especially maybe younger people who are you know, not necessarily focused on international events. So I think there's a constant struggle out in the infosphere, you know. And what I've seen recently is that the Ukrainians were smashing it at the beginning, and they were definitely winning that war. But now I've just seen the appearance of like Russian bots on TikTok and the rest of it starting to push a counter narrative. So I think they've taken a deep breath in Russia, and they're pushing back. So it's constant, you know. This is a struggle that is constant, trying to win hearts, minds, and souls of people. And there's a lot of weird conspiratorial nonsense out there. Q, you know, and Trump, and all this stuff gets mixed up together. So you have quite a, you know, you have that rather dark like Fox, they're not necessarily pro-Putin, but they're definitely Russophiles. So there's a very complex information environment out there, and I think that is a second front, a third front. Well, you know, whatever you say. I mean, it's clear that in Ukraine, people realize how important getting this message out is. Yeah.
Volodymyr?
Yeah, my response to that question is I would like to see the world where Ukraine and Russia are just not used in the same sentence. Because the world has to stop looking at Ukraine through a Russian perspective or with a reference to Russia. Why not look at the world where Ukraine is connected to France, to Germany, to the UK, to US, to Turkey, to Japan, to other places that Ukraine has been in touch with or connected with or involved with for centuries. We are part of a bigger historical European project. The cultural connections, historical connections of Ukraine to so many other places in the world is astonishing. And that's the whole, you know, history out there to explore and discover. And that is something that, you know, sits at the forefront of my daily job of Ukraine's cultural diplomacy, that those connections have to be rediscovered, rebuilt. And Russia in this equation becomes, in a way, irrelevant. That's for the greater good.
Yeah, that is interesting, and it might even be that you can find common cause with, for example, Georgia, which had 25% of the country gobbled up by the Russians, when the West barely reacted at all, and the other countries that are in that region, you know, to win back some of that voice and some of that representation. You know, I think it's not. I understand the imperative at the moment because of Ukraine's singular position, but I think there is a broad cultural coalition to be founded, because I think there's other brothers and sisters in though that you're in a bad neighborhood being up there next door to Russia, and you can help construct something which is a particular local identity, national identity, but something else as well, because of those very countries that you mentioned. I think that's quite an exciting prospect.
Oh, thank you very much for those responses. And I want to refer also to your conversation about humor as a great coping mechanism. As a volunteer, I'm preparing the content for the London weekend rallies, and memes of victory is one of my favorite parts to prepare. And I can confirm that how powerful it is, not only to bring the attention, but also to cheer people, to give them more energy and power to fight back, just to feel their identity and this kind of very vital energy, you know, which gives them strength to hold on. And this is what our conversations are about, to try to find the answer to the question, how can I help? And today, I would say, just be fair. Don't lose your attention and support, and give Ukraine and Ukrainian culture proper space it deserves. And this is probably the answer for today. We're grateful to our brilliant speakers and our partners for today's event, personal Yulia Sienkiewicz for making things happen, and our traditional partners, Pan America, the Ukrainian Institute, the Ukrainian Institute London, Ukraine World, the Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institute, and the Harman Institute at Columbia University. And for all the cross-streaming service.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
Sure.
Before you cut me off, sorry, because I just want to say a personal thank you to Julia Sienkiewicz in particular. As you know, she hooked us up and made this happen.
Yeah.
And to Vladislav Davidson, my friend and journalist who was until yesterday just in Odessa, who has helped give me information from the front line. So thanks to those guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for mentioning each person who is in support of making those events happening. And gratitude, of course, to Pan Ukraine, which continues to stand on the front lines in the name of freedom and truth. And I want to remind you about the important fundraising event of Evgen Stasinevich, a well-known literary critic who switched to be a volunteer and systematically collects aids for Kharkiv in the region: medicine, various humanitarian supplies, and food. He buys and delivers, so Kharkiv will be grateful for any donation. You can find all the details in comments. Ukraine needs your help today. PEN International is proud to be a platform that supports freedom of expression. We don't necessarily agree with each word said, but it's exactly how freedom of expression works, as we could see in today's debate. Thank you one more time, our great speakers. Thank you, our viewers. The next episode will be held on Thursday, 5th of May at 7 p.m. Kyiv time, 5 p.m. London time, and we will have another incredible guest, Troyatsenko, Ukrainian writer who writes for children and adults and has received numerous national literary awards for his latest novel, The Union of Soviet Things, won a BBC Children's Book Award of the year 2021. And he will talk with Pablo Giordano, an Italian writer who won the Premio Stegna Literary Award with his first novel, The Solitude of Prime Numbers. I love those events. I meet all my bookshelves here. So follow our dialogues on war, spread the word, and stand with Ukraine. Remember, this is our shared responsibility today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you,
Thanks,
Peter.
thanks. Nice to meet you, Volodymyr.
In Ukraine again.
I look forward to it. Take care. Thanks, Olha. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ola. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.